Hello and welcome to a discussion on the City of Arcata's growth management element in the General Plan 2045 as proposed. My name is David Loya. I'm the Director of Community Development, the City of Arcata. And this is largely in preparation for the October 24 study session we'll be having with the Planning Commission. Hope you find this informational. Growth management element deals largely with the plan area that the city is concerned with in terms of various boundaries that it has different layers of regulatory authority over. And I'll go into each one of these in turn in the coming slides, but I want you to note from this cartoon graphic that some of these areas overlap, some of them overlap by necessity, and some of them do not overlap completely. Note the urban services boundary and city limits, for example. So I'll take these each in turn to help you understand the purpose of these, and we'll talk a little bit about the legal framework that establishes these different boundaries. I'll show you some maps of the areas. The first is the largest boundary, the planning area. This is largely non-regulatory. The city doesn't have the ability to make planning decisions in the planning area. But this is established by state laws, an area within which the city has some interest in the decisions that are being made in the planning area. And so these are areas outside of the city's direct ability to regulate, but still wants to have some sort of influence. That might be because they're in watersheds that we receive downstream flows of, or because they're in areas that we have particular interest in the aesthetic development of them, or we have areas that we've established as green zones that we want to maintain the green belts around the city of Arcata. And so we want to be able to influence the planning decisions that are happening in that area, but we don't have direct authority. Next is the sphere of influence. The sphere of influence is, for all intents and purposes, the area of anticipated or probable annexation into the city limits. So the sphere of influence is, by definition, outside the city boundaries, inside the planning area, and an area that the Local Agency Formation Commission, or LAFCO, has decided that is potential for annexation into the city boundary. That'll become important when you start looking at some of the maps of those. The next is the urban services boundary. The urban services boundary is largely contained within city limits, but does go outside the city limits. It also does not contain all of the area within the city, because there are areas within the city that we do not provide urban services to. Those urban services are water and sewer. And so the areas within the urban services boundary are the areas where these services can be provided. They cannot be provided outside of the urban services boundary. And then lastly, we have the city limits. This is our jurisdictional boundary. Those are the areas that are inside the city, and we have complete regulatory authority over. Now, these three, the sphere of influence, urban services boundary, and city limits, I want to point out that the city of Arcata has to work with LAFCO in partnership to identify these, but ultimately the LAFCO has the final authority in determining where some of these boundaries lie. And we'll get into those in a little bit more detail as we look at the actual maps. I want to start by going to the planning area. Here is the planning area in the dotted line running up Fickle Hill, encircling Jacoby Creek, coming out, capturing Braycut across the bay and out to the coast. So this is the area, as I mentioned before, that is outside of the city limits, the dark purple line here, that the city wishes to have some kind of influence over. And so when projects are happening in these areas, we have asked the Humboldt County to let us know when they're making those plans so that we can provide public comment or weigh in on those. You can see the area is quite extensive, and it doesn't necessarily correspond to areas that we anticipate ultimately annexing in any way, shape, or form, but it does form the planning area that the city's got an interest in. Next, we'll take a look at the sphere of influence. Again, just orienting to the map here, north is up. The areas that are in light tan are the existing city limits. So the city's light tan. The darker brown color is the sphere of influence. Now, this is an important piece to understand. The LAFCO is in charge of adopting the city's sphere of influence. Now, we do have some ability to weigh in on the sphere of influence, and we provide comment to the LAFCO, but ultimately LAFCO identifies the areas that are within the city's likely areas for annexation. And then we recognize that in our general plan by adopting these maps as well. This is an important distinction in particular because there are areas, for instance, going out Jacoby Creek, that are way outside of the city's boundaries, current boundaries, that LAFCO has identified are probable for annexation in the future. Also of particular note are the areas to the west of the city of Arcata, which include many lands that are, currently agricultural, smaller scale agricultural, but agricultural nonetheless. In addition to areas up Fickle Hill that you see here in the area to the east of the city of Arcata, that is almost completely surrounded by the city with recent annexations leading up to Fickle Hill. There's just a thin sliver of Fickle Hill Road, actually, that separates the city boundary here. And so LAFCO has said that all of these areas are subject to annexation at some point in the future. And it's important for us to consider the financial impact of annexing some of these areas, in particular, those areas up Jacoby Creek or maybe up into Fickle Hill. Now, this is a shift. I just wanted to indicate real quick, this is a shift. We've worked with LAFCO to reduce the sphere of influence, the areas that the city might be subject to annexation, largely because the way that the city adopted its sphere of influence in the General Plan 2020 was to also exert some additional planning priority in those areas. And so at that time, there was a real concern about annexing or development of agricultural lands. And so the city of Arcata had adopted some policy that really indicated that it was using its sphere of influence as a means of protecting these agricultural lands by indicating some additional influence, quote unquote, over the decisions that were being made there. That was sort of an artifact of our thinking. It wasn't actual additional influence that we were exerting. I think the name sphere of influence kind of led us to believe that we would have additional ability to weigh in on planning decisions. The planning area that we just went over is actually gives us all the authority that we will ever have to be able to weigh in on county planning decisions around development in those lands around the city. We've already adopted resolutions identifying green belts, and we've made it real clear that our intent is to protect those agricultural and other resource lands around the city boundaries. And so we've worked with LAFCO over the years to try and reduce the sphere of influence to just those areas that are required to be included. Part of the reason why Jacoby Creek is included is, as we'll see in the next set of slides, because it's in the city's urban services boundary. And so if those areas are in the future unable to provide services for themselves, then that would be a potential reason for annexation of those areas. It's an important planning decision because that would most likely be a fiscally negative decision for the city to make. It would cost us more to annex those areas and serve them than revenues generated from the new land base. And so that would be a difficult decision for the city to make in the future, but that's part of the role for LAFCO and the city's participation. So this image shows us the urban services boundary. Now I know there's a lot going on in this image. I want to draw your attention to just the areas I want you to focus on. The city limits is indicated by the stippled line, the dotted line. And so that shows you where the city limit, city boundary is. The areas in green and blue indicate our urban services boundary. So that's all I want you to focus on for this for a moment. The areas in green are areas that include both water and sewer service. And those are, for the most part, wholly contained within the city, with the exception of Boyd Road to the north here. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is that there are huge areas of the city that are outside the urban services boundary, but still within the city limits. So obviously we don't want to provide water and sewer service to the bay. That's not an area we seek to develop, and so we do not provide services out there. Similarly, the forest does not have an urban services allowance, so we wouldn't provide water and sewer into the forest. The baylands, similarly. And so you're kind of getting a sense for the urban services boundary being yet another limit to the areas that could be developed for urban purposes. And I look at this urban services boundary as sort of the infill footprint within the city of Arcata. These are the areas where we would be looking to build new houses, new businesses. The areas outside the city limits in blue that you see here that have urban services, these are water-only urban services boundaries. So Jacoby Creek has a water system that's connected to the city's water system. We provide water to the Jacoby Creek Water District, and they distribute it from there. But because we provide that urban service outside of our jurisdiction, they have to be within our urban service boundary. Now, I will point out one more piece of information here. The urban services boundary comes, for Jacoby Creek Water District, comes to this area here. This is a square that's defined by parcel lines. But the parcels that are actually hooked up to water and have existing development on them are kind of contained within this area just around these existing roads. And so you'll note that the city's sphere of influence, which is also shown on this map as this dark gray line, city sphere of influence does not encompass the entirety of the urban services boundary. And so this is a point that it may be a little bit too detailed to digest in this particular setting, but I just want to point out that all of these have different meanings. Just because we're providing water service down here in this Jacoby Creek Services District doesn't mean that we would ultimately annex it. The LAFCO limited the annexation line to areas that are existing and receiving water services that have existing urban development. So that's the relationship between these various boundaries. I want to shift gears just for a moment and show you some of the purpose for how the city of Arcata is interpreting its growth management element. We use this largely as a tool to really emphasize the drive to infill development. And so I'll show you a couple of policies and some guiding principles. So this is sort of in the formatter in the growth management element. And I just want to identify for you the three priorities for the city's growth management element are to promote infill development and equity by rehabilitating, maintaining, and improving existing infrastructure that supports infill development. So that's priority number one. To protect the environmental and agricultural resources by protecting and preserving and enhancing natural resources, including working landscapes. Those are the areas outside the city limits, and that's how we're using these various boundaries like our sphere of influence and our plan area. And to encourage efficient development patterns by ensuring that any infrastructure associated with development other than infill development supports new development that does all of the following. It uses land efficiently, is built adjacent to existing developed areas, and is located in an area appropriately planned for growth, and is served by adequate transportation and other essential utilities and services. So the emphasis you see here is that we're really trying to concentrate on infill development. if there is annexation outside those lands, that we're not just annexing greenfields and developing out new infrastructure into those greenfields and building new residential subdivisions, for example, that we're really concentrating those annexation in areas that already have infrastructure that we can leverage um, instead of building new infrastructure. Now, this is a way that we've tried to transition from the old idea about what the sphere of influence was trying to do in this capacity as protecting agricultural lands into the new way of thinking about it, where we're still recognizing the sphere of influence is primarily a boundary within which the city is likely or probable to annex at some point in the future, but prioritizing only those areas, even within that sphere of influence, for annexation if they meet these goals of already being served by infrastructure. I'm going to close by showing you the guiding principles. There's a whole lot of policy that backs these, but I just wanted to reemphasize the main purpose that we're trying to accomplish in our growth management element. And that is that these lands in the sphere of influence should remain rural. We're looking to preserve existing community structure and design and promote resource protection in the planning area. Maintain the urban services boundary so that it's only the existing urban area. Prioritize infill development within our contiguous that are within or contiguous to existing urban uses. We're trying to exclude those areas that are sensitive to flooding and mass wasting, and those areas that are already in working lands, and also incorporating green belts and other designated natural areas. And again, the idea here is to manage the timing and amount of growth that comport with the levels of service and quality of life for existing and new residents. And so the growth management element really sets the stage for emphasizing infill development without going out to our green belts for as long as we possibly can. I hope this has brought some understanding around what the growth management element is for and how we use it in the city of Arcata, and that it really is a tool for emphasizing infill in existing urban areas within the city of Arcata.